As is always the case, we are delighted to have opportunity to be together. And our prayer every time we meet is that the conduct of our services will be pleasing to God and beneficial to each of us. And I trust that that's the case. In our Sunday evening lessons, we've been going through 1 Corinthians, taking various subjects that appear in the book. And just to remind us of where we've been, in fact, we've been studying the second journey when Paul went to Corinth and stayed about a year and a half or so. There were a lot of problems at Corinth. They were enamored with oratory, worldly wisdom. There were dishonest business dealings, obviously, in the marketplace. That's referred to in 1 Corinthians 6. There was immorality associated with pagan idolatrous practices and all kinds of, in the idols temple, all kinds of banqueting and drunkenness and revelry that would occur. And Paul addressed himself to those. He had heard from those of the household of Chloe about some reported conditions, and the first 6 chapters he dealt with that, divided over preachers. It's a very practical book. It's been stated about 1 Corinthians that not so much doctrinal matter as it is people problems. Though doctrine is teaching, but there is teaching certainly on a number of items, but there were people problems, divided over people in the first 4 chapters, divided over immorality in 5. And in chapter 6 he dealt with that. And then there must have been a letter that had been written asking Paul a series of questions, because he said, now concerning the things whereof you wrote. And he dealt with questions that they had about marriage in chapter 7. We spent some time talking about the consciences of others and how we ought to be concerned about those. And he dealt with those ideas in chapters 8, 9, and 10 with the things sacrificed to idols and individual rights that we had. And then we talked in the midst of that last week about the idea of communion, 1 Corinthians 10, and the Lord's Supper and its relation to that in 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through the end of the chapter. In chapters 11 through 14, it seems like he somewhat changes gears. And in chapter 11, in 2 through 16, he says, but in giving you this charge, I praise you that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions which I delivered. And so there were some matters in 2 through 16 concerning headship and how it's shown through covered and uncovered heads. And he praised them for that. However, in 17, he says, but in this I praise you not. And he deals with the Lord's Supper. There's a divine contrast there. And then in chapter 12, he says, now concerning spiritual gifts. And he deals with that and in the context of how they should be used in love in 13 and 14 when they were assembled together. And it's, if you're like I am, and you like to try to take a book and do the very best you can, not just look at what somebody else has said and make your own outline, but do your best to see what is being said, how should I rightly divide that. What I have on the board here is about as best I can do in dealing with this idea, the instructions relative to assemblies and spiritual activities in 11 through 14. We've been, as we've mentioned on this chart, we've been talking about a series of lessons that develop or really come from, evolve out of the text. But tonight I want to talk about covered and uncovered heads from the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 1 and going through verse 16. I'd like for us to read it first, and then we'll make a number of comments on it. Verse 1 is usually understood to rightly belong to the end of chapter 10, because he says, be ye imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ, which goes back to the end of 10, where not giving any occasion to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, and seeking not his own pleasure, but the profit of the many. He had made himself an example in chapter 9, and he talked about rights and foregoing those. So it seems like verse 1 actually belongs in substance to the end of 10. And then we have the word now, verse 2. And then in verse 17, but in giving you this charge, I praise you not. So there's a contrast. But, verse 2, I praise you that you remember me in all things and hold fast the traditions even as I deliver them to you. But I have you know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered or unveiled dishonors her head, for it is one and the same thing as if she were shaven. For if a woman is not veiled or covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is a shame to a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to have his head covered, forasmuch as he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. For neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have a sign of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the woman without the man, nor the man without the woman in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, so is the man also by the woman. But all things are of God. Judge ye in yourselves, is it seemly that a woman pray unto God unveiled or uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seemeth to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. To the best of my ability, I want to outline it in just a moment. Some time back, I tried to write a workbook on 1 Corinthians. And what I did on the charts behind me is I lifted just some of my introductory work because I felt like I tried to overview this as best I could, and I wanted to share it with you. I mentioned no other letter in the New Testament more clearly reveals the character and internal problems of local congregation and how to deal with them than does 1 Corinthians. For that reason, it becomes an extremely practical book for the internal workings of a local church. Each problem is met by applying a spiritual principle. For division over preachers and their oratorical use of worldly wisdom, the remedy is understanding that all preachers are simply servants of God. It is God who gives increases and should be glorified, not men, and the essential need is for all to grow up to into spiritual maturity. That's the first 4 chapters. For fornication among Christians is church discipline until the guilty party repents and is restored, chapter 5. For litigation among members, arbitration within the church, not from those who are without, is in order in chapter 6. For a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever, the concern is to save the unbeliever, not to alienate him or her, chapter 7. For problems relative to things sacrificed to idols, doing nothing that would cause one to stumble, and even relinquishing one's rights are paramount, 8, 9, and 10. And to the best of my ability, in trying to overview all this, what I said in the next paragraph is what I believe it's about. For proper respect and worship relative to headship and the Lord's death, distinct appearances between the sexes as to hair length and covering of one's head, as well as proper observance of the Lord's Supper, were in order. Problems over selfishness and the use of miraculous spiritual gifts would be overcome by understanding that their purposes involve spiritual maturity, edification, and growth of the local church. The motive of love is essential in all this. One is nothing before God. Proper respect. And I think that's seen in the very beginning of the paragraph when he talks about his commendation and the foundation of his argument. If you'll notice again in verse 2 and 3, I praise you that you remember me on all things and hold fast the traditions even as I deliver them to you. I have been around some brethren who said, see there, he says it's just a tradition. And we know that traditions are basically man-made, and well, not necessarily. The word tradition just means something handed down. Certainly there were the traditions of the elders that people were to avoid, the Jews were to avoid. But if you'll notice in 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, Paul uses the same idea concerning traditions, and it's not just something that man came up with or customary practices that were in society that were adopted by the apostles. You'll notice in 2 Timothy 2, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 15. So then, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or by epistle of ours, as in this very letter. And then in verse 6 of chapter 3, we command you, brethren, in the name of the Lord Jesus, that you would draw yourselves from every brother that walks disorderly, and not after the tradition which they received of us. Something that was handed down by the apostles was a divine tradition. It was of God. So back in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, I praise you that you remember me in all things and hold fast the tradition, even as I delivered them to you. These were apostolic teachings that he's given, not some customary or custom that was in a particular city that he's adopted, but these were divine commandments given. And then the basis of it is seen in verse 3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. That's foundational, headship. And it's shown by covered and uncovered heads. But that is the foundational building block of the whole paragraph, as far as I can say, is headship and how it's shown. I have been around some brethren. Well, let me back up. I take it to be that when Paul says, I praise you that you keep what I've given you, but then he kind of turns around and says, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of Christ is God, the head of the woman is man. That they were doing things that were right, but they were deficient in their understanding. Sometimes people, some brethren have come and gone, they had to be doing things wrong, because else why would he have said that? I said, that's not necessarily true. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, now I make known unto you the gospel, which I preached unto you, which also you received. Does that mean they were keeping it wrong or they didn't understand? They had obeyed the gospel. But there were some ramifications of the gospel concerning the resurrection that they were unsure of, and maybe they're mistaken about. And so Paul was clearing up some deficiencies in their understanding. I take it to be the same here. But I would have you know, I praise you that you're keeping these things that I've taught you. But I want you to know the basis of it. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. And then as he moves on to the declaration or the instructions, every man that grows out of this, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered or unveiled dishonors her head. For it is one and the same thing as if she were shaven. For if a woman is not veiled, let her also be shorn. But if it's a shame to a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be veiled. So here is a dishonor for a woman to be shorn, that is to have her hair cut short, or to have it all shaved completely off. That's a shame. Now, who made that a shame? There are a lot of people who go around and they see no shame about it. There are some who say, well, it was a shame that women of loose moral character went around with, but they don't know that. There are a lot of things that are assumed about the first century, especially in Greek cities, that really some dictionaries can only go back so far, 4th or 5th, 6th centuries. And sometimes people will base what they think happened in the 1st century on what they read about that actually is commentary on the 6th century. But nonetheless, getting back to the point here, he says in verse 4, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. Every woman praying or prophesying with her head unveiled dishonors her head. And if she prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, he says it's as if you were shaved or shorn, which is a dishonor. So therefore it's a dishonor for her to pray or prophesy with her head uncovered. So the declaration of instructions that he gives here is that the covered man is dishonored, an uncovered woman, just the opposite, is dishonored. And it's as shameful as to be shaven or to be shorn. Well, why? Why is that true? Well, he shows about 4 reasons in the following verses in 7 through 12. For a man indeed ought not to have his head veiled. And the reason is, for as much as he is the image and glory of God. That's really a commentary on Genesis 1. When on the 6th day of creation, God created man in his image and after his likeness. It was the crowning work of his creation. And then in Genesis 2, it's not good for man to be alone. So he performed the first surgical operation in the history of man by extracting a rib from his side and with it making Eve. She brought her to him, and that was, of course, the beginning of the first family. But she was formed of man, from man. Man was formed in the image of God, and then the woman is the glory of the man, he says in verse 7. But the woman is the glory of the man. Verse 8. Then he refers to creation. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. There again, same thing. The not only priority in creation, as he mentions in 1 Timothy 2, but it's also the man was created first, and then the woman was created of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Verse 9, that is, the woman was created to be a helpmeet for him. Genesis, the 2nd chapter. For this cause ought a woman to have a sign of authority on her head, because of the angels. And that raises a lot of question. What does the angels mean? Whatever it means, it's one of the reasons that he gives that a man ought to be uncovered and a woman ought to be covered when they pray or prophesy. It could very well be that in the context here of headship, that he's reminding the readers of angels that fell, that kept not their proper habitation, that Jude mentions, 2 Peter 2 also. That could be it. It could also be, like is mentioned back in chapter 4, about men or angels, that the angels are beholding the worship that we engage in. And there's an order of angels, and they see what's going on, and so we need to respect that headship in light of that. Whatever the case is, it's a reason that Paul gives why a man should be uncovered and a woman covered. However, verse 11, nevertheless neither is the woman without the man, nor the man without the woman in the Lord. That is, each is dependent upon the other. For as the woman is of the man, that is, she was created from him, so is the man also by the woman through the laws of procreation. But all things are of God. And is God, everything descends from God. God made man, he made woman from man, made woman for man. And all of this is of God. And so, as I mentioned on the outline, the explanation of why and to respect this headship and show it, as he identifies here, is because man is made in the image of glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. She was taken of man. She was created for man. And because of the angels. Yet, I don't know if we might say, to keep man from getting a big head about it, both are dependent upon each other, verses 11 and 12. He raises a couple of rhetorical questions in verses 13, 14, and 15. Judge ye in yourselves. Is it seemly that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Well, based on everything he said so far, the answer is obvious. It's no. It's not seemly or fitting that a woman pray unto God unveiled. And then he uses nature. Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory for her, or to her. For her hair is given her for a covering, not the covering, but it is a natural covering. But then he gives a warning, a universal application, and a warning to any adversaries, that if any man seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. I have tried to answer some questions of some brethren I love very much, who've said to me, well, Philip, it looks like there in verse 16 that the whole thing's a matter of custom. And I said, well, what was the custom? Whatever the custom was, Paul said, we don't have. It's a negation. It's not everything I've been saying is customary. He says, if any man seems to be contentious over what? Contentious over what I've been saying. We, the apostles, had no such custom. Neither the churches of God. This is a universal teaching that I've been given. Very similar to chapter 16, when he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I gave order to the churches of Galatia. He didn't just tell the Corinthians, hey, you need to give every first day of the week. This was universal in application. And so it is, if any man seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. The apostles and other churches don't have his, that is the contentious man's, custom. Sometimes that people will lasso that phrase and say that's all it is. It's just custom. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. This commendation and explanation for showing headship in the first 16 verses, as I mentioned, the commendation, the foundation of the argument is a contrast to what we see in verse 17. You'll notice that. Now I praise you, but in this I praise you not, verse 17. I praise you in this teaching that you're keeping that is contrasted to the Lord's Supper. There's no rebuke here, but in this I praise you not. There is, because it's not possible, he said, for you to partake of the Lord's Supper. One's hungry, another's drunken, and so on. They had kept the ordinances, but they had perverted the ordinances relative to the Lord's Supper. And insofar as this is concerned, there were warnings if not kept. But then in the Lord's Supper, there were warnings because they were perverted. And so I think that's significant to see the contrast between what he is commending in 2 through 16 and what he is condemning in 17 through 34. Again, I believe some brethren have missed the point, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. The reason I say that in the significance at the bottom of that chart is because some argue that the custom at Corinth was for moral and submissive women to appear in public with covered heads. Immoral women and unsubmissive women appeared with uncovered heads. So Paul desired the Christian women to appear moral and submissive in public. I've read that in several places. Some women thought that their spiritual equality with men allowed them to remove the sign of their submission. Hence they were appearing uncovered, and so Paul reprimanded or condemned them and wrote what we have here. I don't think that's right at all. Back in 1938, I believe it was, Brother C.R. Nickel, who did a lot of good in his writings and a lot of things, came out with a book that in some senses I think was unfortunate. It was called God's Woman. Bible dictionary, and most of the older works that you can read, Bible dictionaries can only go back so far because there's just not enough historical evidence to show exactly about these matters what was going on in the first century. Usually it's talked about from post-Mohammedan times. And then such assumptions forget that Paul does not speak here of how women should appear at the marketplace or in home, but when they pray or prophesy. This is a part of what some call the custom view. They say, well, Paul, this was customary for people, but Paul didn't say anything about that. He didn't say, this is how you ought to be when you're out in public. We don't want the world to think that we're, loose. That's not what Paul said. He said, when you pray or prophesy. And then later on in verse 13, he just mentioned prayer, didn't even mention prophesying. So those are reasons I believe that the custom view would not be correct. Sometimes related to that, people will ask this question. In fact, I was reading early this morning in a New King James Study Bible that I have, and they use this. This was one of the arguments they made, that this was just customary and it was similar to foot washing and the holy kiss. I don't believe that's an accurate assessment either. A foot washing goes all the way back. The first time we have any reference to foot washing in the Old Testament is Genesis the 18th chapter, where Abraham was extending hospitality to the angels who appeared as men who came to him to talk with him about the fact that he would have a son through Isaac. I get it right, through Sarah. I started to say through Mary, through Sarah. But that happened. Then when Jesus talked about it in John 13, it was not a new practice, but an old practice that demonstrated service and humility. And in Genesis 20, foot washing, that was practiced because feet were dirty. And it was a sign of humility. And I think whatever would correspond to that today, we ought to be willing to do. If it's changing some people and they can't take care of themselves, that would be similar to that. Or if they were dirty and we tried to give them a bath, or their feet needed to be washed. And even kissing, greetings, they don't need to be sensual. They need to be holy. And so all of those things would apply, and I don't believe that would nullify in any sense the instructions he gives here in 1 Corinthians 11. Again, the teaching on the covering, that men pray or prophesy with uncovered heads and that women pray or prophesy with covered heads, is to be observed at a specific time when praying or prophesying. It's not observed earlier than the New Testament, to the best of my knowledge, and it would last as long as men and women prayed or prophesied. The teaching on foot washing is not related to any acts of worship. It's observed in the Old Testament several places, and it lasts as long as people have dirty feet, and practiced hundreds of years before Christ, and essential, as Jesus said in John 13:10, only when it was necessary. Remember when he was washing the feet of the disciples, and he came to Peter and says, Peter said, Lord, don't do that. No, not me. And he says, if I don't do this, you don't have any part. Well, wash not my feet off, but my whole body. He says, no, just the part that's dirty. It accomplished, it was not a sign or symbol, it accomplished a need and was done out of humility. So when you hear people say, well, that teaching on the covered and uncovered head, that's just like foot washing and the holy kiss. It's just customary to the time, has no relevance today. You know that's not a right parallel. That's not accurately handling the Scripture. Well, what was the custom? If people argue this, and this is one of the more commonly held arguments against what I believe the Bible teaches, they said, well, it's just a custom. What was the custom? Was it that Corinth was a prayerful city that started a custom that any woman praying or prophesying must wear a veil? That's not true. They were mostly pagan and they had Jews. And was it that religious idolaters started a custom that any woman leading a prayer must wear a veil? And Paul encouraged Christians at Corinth to observe the idolaters' custom? That doesn't make good nonsense. Did the church at Corinth start a custom that any woman praying must wear a veil, and Paul encourages them in making their own laws? That doesn't make good nonsense either. And so what could it be? Is there another answer? I believe it's Paul commanded, not custom, not based on custom, but he commanded all Christian men to be uncovered when praying or prophesying, all Christian women to be covered when doing the same. The custom that neither we, which would include the apostles, nor the churches of God have, is of the contentious man who contends for covered men and uncovered women. The very opposite. He would be contentious over teaching and practicing the opposite of what Paul had just